providing updates on the DREAM Act, DACA, litigation, and the Muslim Ban 3.0. My name is Ignacia Rodriguez from NILC. Joining us today are Diana Pliego, Avide Musavin, and Jessica Hansen from NILC. Before we hear from our first speaker, I'll go over some housekeeping rules. Participants on the call are in listen-in mode, meaning you are on mute. If you wish to ask a question, please use the question and answers box located on the right side of your screen to enter your question at any time. We will have about 20 minutes at the end of this call to answer your questions. Also, if you experience any technical difficulties during this call, including difficulty hearing the speakers, please let us know using the Q&A box. We will send you the PowerPoint slides on Monday with the link to the recording. We will now begin by hearing a legislative update on the DREAM Act from Diana.
Hi, everyone. As Ignacia said, my name is Diana Pliego. I'm a policy associate here in the DC office, and I'm just going to quickly go over some of the legislative updates. I'm sure you are all curious with all that's going on in the news, so just going to give you a quick rundown of what's happening right now, and then Ignacia will tell you a little bit more about how you can get plugged in to make things happen. All right, so if we can go to that first slide. So right now, where is the DREAM Act? Next. So as you all are probably very aware, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which granted young immigrants who were here from a very young age, it granted them a work permit, a social security number, and it granted them protection from deportation on a renewal basis. The program was ended on September 5th of this year. And President Trump ended that and gave Congress a deadline to pass a permanent legislative solution by March 5th. But one thing that we want to make really clear to everyone is that even though that is a deadline that's being thrown out in the news, it really is a false deadline. If many of you are friends with or know of Dreamers themselves, you might have heard that there are people who are already losing their protections due to many reasons, because in that 1 month window that a few folks, only those folks who expired before March 5th were allowed to renew. Not everybody was able to renew, and for reasons of, maybe they didn't have the money, or maybe their package got lost in the mail. There were approximately 22,000 people who will expire before March 5th as a result of that termination. That's 122 people a day, and starting March 5th, the only thing that will happen is that number will grow to over 1,000 people a day. To this date now, there's over 11,000 who have already lost it, and so really right now, this is a really urgent time for people to get involved and to really let their members of Congress know that we need a solution now. So if we can go into the next slide. Awesome. And so I think maybe people have heard that there's a lot going on right here in DC. Just some quick updates from what happened just yesterday. Yesterday, House and Senate leadership from both sides of the aisle met with President Trump, and this was all to talk about the year-end spending bill that they have to get done before they go home for the holidays, before the end of the year. And of course, one of the big topics was the DREAM Act. However, from that meeting, we weren't able to get a whole lot of information. All we know is that there were no deals made. The conversations will continue, and Republicans have made it very clear coming out of that meeting that they do not want to see DREAM tied to any kind of budget, which of course is something that we know Congress has to get done, and so we see it as an opportunity to also pass DREAM. But Republicans do not want to see that happen, and Democrats on their way out also reiterated that they will not go home without a solution for DACA recipients. So that's where we're at coming out of that White House meeting. On the congressional side, yesterday both the House and Senate voted to extend the budget, which was set to expire today, and so they voted yesterday to extend it by 2 weeks through a continuing resolution. And what that means is that instead of voting on new ways to fund the government, they're going to continue to fund the government at the levels that have already been set for just another 2 weeks until they can make decisions and negotiations and get things done, which means we are now at December 22nd for the key date when Congress has to yet again vote on a year-end spending bill before they go home for recess and to be with their families for the holidays. As you can see, there were split decisions on whether or not to extend this budget. The House passed it 235 votes to 193. A lot of Democrats actually withheld their vote for reasons including the DREAM Act and many others, but it was primarily, I think from what they have told us, is that they decided not to vote to extend the budget because there were too many things that were not resolved, including the DREAM Act, which is the top priority for them. And in the Senate, majority, only some Democrats withheld their vote for those same reasons. And so where we're at now, I think I'll talk a little bit more on the next slide, but right now we really need to get the message to Congress that we cannot let this be pushed off into the next year, where we're not sure what will happen, and with DACA recipients who need a program to be implemented as soon as possible. So next slide. So what's at stake? As I mentioned before, we think that right now that our best chance to pass DREAM Act this year is to attach it to the budget. The way that what happens is it's very common practice for Congress to attach bills to the end of year spending bill that they were not able to pass throughout the year. Important things that they couldn't agree on, but so they attach it to that. It gets it through because it's a must-pass bill. And so common practice, again, we think this is our best chance to get it in before the end of the year. However, Republicans are saying that they don't want it tied to the budget. They want it to go as a standalone bill, meaning they want it to go through a whole separate process, but that comes with greater risks and a slower process. What we do know is that Republicans need Democrats to pass this year-end spending bill. But because Republicans, as you know, hold the control in House, Senate, and the White House, we recognize that there will have to be trade-offs made at the end. And so I'm just going to very quickly go over some of these threats that we see as Republicans are trying to attach something to DREAM. They say if you want DREAM in exchange, then you're going to have to give a little bit. And so these are some of the bills that we have heard discussed that are likely to be included and that we're fighting back against because we absolutely do not want to see these things hurt immigrant communities. So one would be what is known as a SMART bill, but we're calling AKA the Big Brother at the Border bill here at NILC, because a lot of what it does is it increases funding for technology and surveillance use at the border. What exactly that looks like isn't completely clear, but there are concerns that surround the increase in surveillance and the invasion of privacy for those not only going through the border, but those communities that are living at the border. This could come in the way of drones, biometric scanners, scanners to scan vehicles coming in, and just other technologies that can cause concerns about privacy. And then there's also Kate's Law, which you might have heard related to the death of Kate Stanley. And this really what it would do is we're calling it the More Profits for Private Prisons Act, because it really just criminalizes people seeking reentrance into the United States. Oftentimes people come back seeking to be reunited with their families or seeking protection from persecutions in their home countries. And what this bill would do is it really expands the punishments for people seeking that kind of reentrance. And it also strips people of their due process protections by restricting their ability to challenge the deportation order. So if they received it and they believe they do have, a solid claim for asylum, they may not be able to challenge that. And it overall just criminalizes people seeking to reunite with their families and seeking protections. And then there's another bill that's called the Comstock Gang Bill that we're calling the Mass Criminalization Bill. What this bill does is it really creates an overly broad definition of criminal gang in immigration law in ways that really just kind of creates an illusion of a gang where none might exist. So this, of course, gets more immigrants and people of color caught in the prison pipeline and on their way to deportation. And it raises a lot of due process concerns and racial profiling concerns, as one of the requirements, for example, is that it's a mandatory detention of anyone suspected of being in a gang. And of course, this is without trial, this is without due process, and something that we're really fighting back against. And then on the DREAM front, we are hearing that this is obviously what, for example, Democrats are fighting for, but it is likely that it may not come out being called DREAM, or that it might be slightly different. We are hearing right now that it is largely the same, just as inclusive as DREAM, but I think that at the end of the day, it is a political game, and Republicans want to pass something that they can call their own. But right now, that's just kind of where we're at. If we can go on to the next slide. And right now, I think I'm just going to hand it over to Ignacia, who's going to talk a little bit more about what's happening on the field and the communications realm, and how you guys can get involved in this fight for a DREAM Act before the end of the year.
Thank you, Diana. So now we'll provide a communications and field update on the DREAM Act. Every day that Congress fails to pass a solution for DACA recipients, 122 people lose their work permits and protection from deportation. More than 10,000 young immigrants have already been handed this cruelty, while hundreds of thousands more wait in limbo. Immigrant youth cannot wait any longer, and the time to act is now. And that's why immigrant youth and allies have been taking action and will continue to in hopes that the DREAM Act be passed by the end of this year. One action happened on December 5th. The AAPI Immigrant Rights Organizing Table and Undocu Black Network hosted a press conference featuring undocumented young people and TPS holders. It also included members of Congress, including Congresswoman Judy Chu. There was also the delivery of a credo petition with over 200,000 signatures to Senate Majority Leader McConnell, Speaker Paul Ryan, Senator Schumer, and Leader Nancy Pelosi, along with visits to Capitol Hill offices. Then on December 6th, over 5,000 people came from all parts of the country to DC to demand a DREAM Act now. Even immigrants and allies got arrested at the Capitol building, demanding an action now. There continues to be rallies and actions happening across the country, not only in DC. For example, the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights of Los Angeles, CHIRLA, and the California Dream Network complete their 3-day hunger strike today, culminating in a candlelight vigil. And so given all this momentum and all these actions happening across the country, it's really important for all of us to do our part and to make sure that we call our members of Congress and urge them to pass a DREAM Act by the end of this year. On your screen is a phone number where you can call and get connected to your representative. There's also other ways to get involved. For example, we encourage you to check out the Butterfly Collective podcast. This is a podcast that was released right before Thanksgiving. It's available on all the platforms that are listed on your screen. And it's great to actually use to have conversations with people. So I know you're joining this call because you care about DREAM, you care about DACA, but maybe there's people in your lives that are not as aware of this issue. And so being able to listen firsthand from dreamers and from directly affected people on what their experiences have been like and what they're doing to take action is really empowering and encouraging, and will hopefully encourage your friends and family members who listen to also join the movement. As I mentioned, you can call your member of Congress. We cannot emphasize that enough. There's been congressional representatives who have said that there's no urgency, that people have until March, and that is false. And so it's important for us to show our support for this issue and to really emphasize the urgency and why we need this now. You can also visit weareheretostay.org, which has a listing of events that are taking place and also has information on how to contact your member of Congress. You can join local rallies and events to show your support. And again, can't emphasize it enough. Please share what you've learned and why you're part of the fight with your friends and family. And we've, seen so many supporters from so many different areas, including faith-based leaders and Fortune 500 companies. And it's really encouraging to see so much support pouring in. But we do want to take a moment to talk a little bit about messaging, because people who have the best intentions sometimes end up using messaging that actually hurts the broader immigrant rights movement. And so here in front of you are some points that were created by our friends at CIPC. So one example is to avoid using certain rhetoric like, instead of going after actual criminals and bad hombres, Trump is ... The reality is Trump is persecuting immigrants who are deeply rooted in our families and our communities, and so that's the messaging we want to go across. We don't want to feed into his language about bad hombres and going after criminals. When it comes to case law, as Diana shared, we prefer to call it More Profits for Private Prisons Act when we refer to it, and that's for many reasons. So one, the Steinle family has asked for their daughter's death to not be used for political reasons, and so we want to respect that and not invoke her daughter's name. Also, we want people to take time to actually read what's in the law, right? What changes it would actually make. And so the idea behind using this language instead is hopefully to give people more of a sense of what's at stake. Another messaging point to avoid is local law enforcement should be focused on keeping criminals off the street. And the reason that we want that to be changed to instead focus on how all of us, regardless of where we were born and what we look like, should be able to call 911 when we need help, is because the reality is that rhetoric like this really criminalized not just immigrants, but people of color in general. And so we want to make sure that we instead talk more about how policies that turn local police into deportation agents really create divisions between police and the communities that they serve. So we want to highlight that instead. We want to avoid using the word criminal as much as possible, just because, again, there's been this stance, especially from the right, to criminalize our communities at large. And lastly, I'd like to share some resources. So United We Dream, they're the National Coalition of Immigrant Youth, and they have so many wonderful resources on their website. They also have links to be able to easily get a hold of your member of Congress and show your support. They also have really active social media pages. So if you go to their Facebook page or their Twitter, you can repost, retweet messages that they're sending out, calls to action, and you can also witness live footage of all the actions that they have planned in the next few weeks. There's also a link for our website, nilk.org. There's lots of publications on various topics, including frequently asked questions on the DREAM Act. There's also a top 5 reasons why we need the DREAM Act now that was created in partnership with United We Dream and Black. For those of you who are allies, I encourage you to check out Indivisible's website. They actually have an immigrant ally toolkit that's user-friendly. NACASEC is another great partner that has a lot of ways to get involved listed on their website. And finally, Black Network, they also have great resources, including a video that explains why it is that we're demanding a clean DREAM Act now. We will now receive an update on DACA-related litigation from Jess. And as a reminder, we will be sending you copies of the PowerPoint and the webinar recording next week. Jess?
Thanks, Ignacia. Hi, everyone. This is Jess Hansen. I'm a fellow and attorney in our LA office, and I wanted to give an update on the litigation to defend DACA. So as you know, there are several cases challenging the termination of the DACA program. Today, I'll be talking mostly about the 2 main cases that are the most far advanced in their proceedings, which is the New York set of cases and the California cases. NILC, along with Make the Road New York and the Jerome N. Frank Legal Services Organization at Yale Law School, are counsel in Batalla Vidal v. Duke, a case in the Eastern District of New York. 17 states and the District of Columbia also filed suit in the same district, and their case was related to our case and is on a similar track. The cases are still proceeding separately, but they're both before the same district judge and magistrate judge. And in our Bataya Vidal case, we filed both statutory and constitutional claims against the termination of the DACA program. So we began the process of discovery, or the ability to ask the other side for documents and answers to questions. As part of that discovery under the statutory claim, which is called the Administrative Procedure Act, the government must produce what is called an administrative record that shows everything that the agency decision maker considered in making her decision, in this case, the decision to terminate the DACA program. The government did produce an administrative record, but it was only 256 pages, which is really short for an administrative record, that consisted of all documents that were already publicly available online. We knew that they were not sharing everything that they had actually considered in terminating DACA, so we asked our judge to order them to complete the administrative record, and the district court did order that. However, the government then filed a request to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals to stay or pause our discovery because they thought that the district court order was unfair, the order to complete the administrative record. So they filed that stay request, and they also filed what is called a mandamus request, which is a request to ask a circuit court or a higher court to order a lower court to do something, in this case, to stop the order regarding the completion of the administrative record. So the Second Circuit granted the government's stay of discovery pending that same court's review of the mandamus request. So ever since then, our discovery has been on pause. The Second Circuit has not yet issued an opinion on the mandamus request in our case, but we do have oral argument on the matter scheduled for next week on December 14th, and we're hoping for the Second Circuit's holding soon thereafter. That holding could potentially lift the stay on discovery and allow us to do more. In the small amount of discovery we were able to do, we discovered that there's a real callous disregard for human lives within some of the decision makers behind the termination of the DACA program. We want to learn more about what fueled this heartless decision. And in addition to all this, we also have a deadline of next Friday, the 15th, to file our big motion for a preliminary injunction to the district court. And that's our request to ask the district court to immediately stay or stop the termination of the DACA program. And then we have oral argument on that matter on January 18th. And we're hoping for a decision sometime in early February on that. Next slide. Meanwhile, the California cases, which involve various cases proceeding together as one case in the Northern District of California, were proceeding with their discovery process as well, and the government was expected to file a completed administrative record as well on December 22nd. However, the judge in that case determined that the government had failed to provide all the records they considered when deciding to continue with DACA or not, and ordered them to produce the administrative record earlier than they wanted to. So in response, last Friday, the government filed a petition with the U.S. Supreme Court asking the government to stay the ongoing proceedings in California and seeking permission to file a writ of mandamus with the Supreme Court, where they will ask the Supreme Court to stop the district court from continuing with the order to complete the administrative record in that case. So the government's decision to request help from the Supreme Court on a discovery matter, which is generally left to district courts to decide, highlights this government's lack of transparency and their intent to hide documents that may raise questions as to why they terminated DACA. Their request to the Supreme Court only highlights that the termination of DACA was based on unlawful considerations. In fact, the government's lack of honesty in those proceedings led the district court in California, the judge there, to submit a statement to the U.S. Supreme Court himself yesterday, informing the Supreme Court that the government had mischaracterized that judge's own statements when the judge asked the court for a stay of discovery. When the government asked the Supreme Court for a stay of discovery. The plaintiffs in the California cases filed an opposition to this stay request at the Supreme Court just this past Wednesday. We're waiting for the Supreme Court to make a decision on the government's stay request in the California cases. I want to emphasize that the stay request to the Supreme Court was only submitted in the California cases, and our cases in New York remain on track with their original oral arguments, and our case in general. That's the bigger picture of what's going on in these two sets of cases. But as you know, the termination of DACA the memo terminating the DACA program gave people with certain DACA expiration dates a chance to renew those grants of DACA within 1 month by October 5th. We have heard a lot of stories of people being affected negatively by this October 5th deadline. The three main situations we've heard about are, one, the person's application was mailed timely, but unreasonably delayed by the mail service itself and arrived on October 5th, but was still rejected as untimely. Two, the application was mailed timely, but unreasonably delayed again by the mail, and it arrived after October 5th, but was rejected as untimely. And three, the application was mailed timely and received before, on, or after October 5th, but it was rejected, the entire application rejected because of a minor clerical error, such as forgetting to check one box, forgetting a signature, or having the wrong amount of money in the money order. After we heard a lot of these stories, we decided to bring them to the government's attention through our Batalla Vidal case in New York. We wrote our opposing counsel a letter raising several cases, individual cases in this situation, and asking them to reconsider. Several days later, without having an answer from opposing counsel, we asked our judge for a hearing on the matter and to request to amend our original complaint, which is the document that starts a lawsuit, in order for us to include these claims of cases being unreasonably rejected. The judge set a hearing for us, and then the night before that hearing, USCIS released a statement saying that it would allow certain people who were unreasonably rejected only because of mail delays, to resubmit their renewals. The next day in our hearing, which went forward, the judge granted us permission to amend our complaint before January 5th if necessary. As of today, USCIS has released more FAQs and guidance on how to resubmit your DACA renewal if it was rejected because of mail delays. And I've included that link here in the slide. However, there is still no relief for individuals whose applications were rejected because of minor clerical errors. So we sent another letter to opposing counsel about that matter, and we are again trying to put pressure through this case on the government to reconsider those applications that were rejected because of clerical errors. And since they did change their position before because of advocacy, we think that if we continue to raise these cases and push the government with advocacy about these clerical error situations, we're hoping that they might change their mind on that as well. Stay tuned, and if your DACA renewal was rejected for these or other reasons and you would like to share your story with us, please fill out the survey linked to here. I'll stop there, but I'm happy to answer questions at the end.
Thank you, Jess. Now we will hear from our final speaker, Abide, who will share with us updates on the Muslim Ban 3.0.
Thanks, Ignacia. I wanted to update folks on things that have been happening with respect to a series of different executive proclamations and orders that we kind of commonly refer to as the Muslim ban. So it can get kind of confusing because there's now currently 4 different iterations of things that we've referred to as the Muslim ban. So I want to encourage folks to refer to a cheat sheet that we developed in the hyperlink here that you'll get in the materials following today's field call. But just to briefly recap, there were initially 2 orders earlier this year, both of which were blocked by the courts and were temporary in nature. And now what we're currently seeing is that there is a 3rd version of a Muslim ban, this time targeting 8 countries, 6 of which are Muslim majority. And while lower courts at the district level had originally blocked that ban from going forward, for the most part, there was a big development this week. On Monday, the Supreme Court, so the highest court in the country, said that this ban can go into full effect. And what's notable about what the Supreme Court did is that it didn't make any exceptions. So while a previous version of the ban was allowed to go into partial effect, the Supreme Court had said that for people who have, quote unquote, a bona fide relationship to a person or entity in the U.S., that for those people, they would not be banned. This time, however, the Supreme Court didn't create that kind of exception. And as I mentioned before, this version of the ban is permanent in nature. It's indefinite. So the Supreme Court did not rule on the substance or the merits of the ban itself, but it's a very demoralizing message to communities around the country and around the globe, frankly, to have the Supreme Court have sort of given that permission to the government to have the ban move forward. What it means is that there are now two cases that I'll talk about in a minute that were heard this week before circuit courts. And those cases are looking at the merits of the ban itself. And so the ban itself is still challenged in the courts, but the Supreme Court basically said, until those circuit courts issue a decision and there's a request for us to take up the case, this ban is going to stay in effect. So unless the Supreme Court declines to actually hear the case, then the ban will, not go forward. Or if eventually the Supreme Court says we're going to hear the case, but until we issue a final judgment on the ban will stay in effect. So it's complicated, and what it means in shorthand is essentially that we think it's quite likely the Supreme Court will take up this case. The reason they didn't previously take up the case is because it was temporary and eventually expired, and so the Supreme Court basically said it's moot, it's no longer relevant for us. That's not the case this time. So we do expect the Supreme Court will be listening to challenges on the Muslim ban 3.0. And the way that the Supreme Court wrote its order on Monday essentially said to the circuit courts, you better hurry on up in issuing your decisions. And we expect the Supreme Court then will be moving very quickly on this. That's how long the actual SCOTUS, the Supreme Court order, will stay in effect. And then in terms of the scope of it, we were informed by the government after the Supreme Court order that for anyone who's from the banned countries that are affected under Muslim Ban 3.0, that all of those people, if they had a visa in hand prior to Monday, December 4th, then they should still be able to travel. I want to emphasize that what happens in writing is very different than what happens in practice and on the ground. And as you may remember, back in January, there was an extreme amount of chaos and confusion, not just in airports in the U.S., but around the globe. There was extreme confusion and chaos and fear from a lot of people who weren't even nationals of the banned countries. We're entering the holiday season. We're getting numerous inquiries, as are our partners, from people who want to know, at the end of this semester, can they go home to see their families? Can they go celebrate important landmark events in their families, whether it's weddings or holidays and things like that? And so people really feel like their lives are suspended right now because they're just unclear about how the ban itself will be implemented. So we don't take for granted that there's going to be appropriate oversight or implementation of it, which is why we're really encouraging people to be vigilant if they're hearing things. We obviously don't want to cause unnecessary or additional panic or alarm, but we want to really signal the message to the government that our eyes and ears are on the ground. I'll also just flag that there's currently an ongoing debate where the Department of Homeland Security's own internal watchdog, the Inspector General for that agency, has been struggling to publish a report that shows how Customs and Border Protection mishandled implementation of a prior ban earlier this year. So that's all the more reason for us to really stay focused and vigilant about how the ban is being monitored. There's no guidance yet. There is language in the ban that says there can be a waiver on certain grounds, for example, if someone has an urgent medical need or in certain situations, but we have no information yet as to when or how often or under what circumstances those would be granted. So that's why monitoring is key and why continuing to challenge the ban is really key. So that's what happened in the Supreme Court earlier this week. In the meantime, as I mentioned, the ban itself still continues to be challenged in other courts while it's winding its way up to the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court didn't say anything other than that it can go forward. So on Wednesday in the Ninth Circuit in Seattle, there were oral arguments in a case that was brought by the state of Hawaii challenging Muslim Ban 3.0. And today, just about an hour ago, we concluded oral arguments in a case that NILC is co-counseling with ACLU and others called IRAP v. Trump. where we're challenging Muslim Ban 3.0 as well. Again, pursuant to what the Supreme Court said earlier this week, we expect that the Fourth and Ninth Circuits will issue opinions very soon, and perhaps even by the end of this calendar year. And then after that, it'll be up to the Supreme Court whether or not it will be hearing the cases. So stay tuned, because there's a lot that we are expecting to happen in the coming days and weeks. Finally, I'll just mention some other cases that are challenging the bans. In October, there was a fourth version of the Muslim ban, and again, I encourage folks to look at the cheat sheet for reference points around what countries specifically are targeted under each ban. The 4.0 version of the ban is currently in effect. It targets refugees of 11 Muslim majority countries who comprise the overwhelming majority of Muslim refugees who've resettled in the U.S. over the last couple of years. So that's why, in our view, it's still a Muslim ban, even though it says it's targeting refugees. It's just using refugees as a proxy term for Muslims. So that ban has drastically impacted the ability for refugees from these Muslim majority countries to come into the U.S. And there is a hearing on December 21st before a district court in Seattle. And on the same day, there's also a court that's challenging the impact of a prior version of the ban on diversity visa lottery winners. So diversity visa lottery winners are people who don't have a family or employment-based reason for being able to get an immigrant visa to come to the U.S. So by definition, they're lacking in that, quote, bona fide relationship to a U.S. person or entity. And so that was a category of people that were left out of protection from the prior bans. And so there is a court date coming up on December 21st here in Washington, D.C. And so again, we'll keep you posted on the various developments, and always feel free to ask questions, and certainly we'll take some at the end of today's conversation. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Abide. And so now on your screen, you should see a list of resources if you're interested in finding out more about any of these topics. The first one is an overview of the Muslim bans. There's been at least 3 versions, and so if you want more information on that, you can go to that link. There's also a top 5 reasons why the DREAM Act can't wait until 2018 document, which I referenced earlier on our NILC website. There's also an FAQ on the DREAM Act 2017 if you're interested in knowing specifics of the bill. There's also a link here for the Support Clean Dream Act, and this also has a link to the video I referenced earlier on why it is that we're demanding a clean dream featuring Andaki Black's Patrice. There's also been a lot of questions, which we didn't cover today, around what are the consequences of losing DACA for educational opportunities. And so we created a basic facts about in-state tuition for undocumented immigrant students, also available on the NILC.org website. There's also information on how the DREAM Act would help health professionals be able to stay in school. So DACA actually allowed a lot of people who aspired to be doctors, nurses, and to participate in other related professions in the medical field the opportunity to actually go to school and to actually get licensed for these professions. And so this document highlights how losing DACA would affect their aspirations, and how the DREAM Act would actually help them to continue to be in school and to continue pursuing their aspirations. And lastly, we have a link to here for a table, that showcases all the proposed legislation aiming to protect DACA recipients and immigrant youth. So perhaps in the news you've heard about the RAC Act bridge. There's all these bills that are being considered. Today we focused on the DREAM Act since that's the one we're pushing for, but if you're interested in finding out what all of those bills are about, we encourage you to follow that link to learn more. We will now begin the Q&A section of this call. As a reminder, please type your question in the box located on the right hand of your screen. You can also submit questions to be answered at a later time to our email address, reply@nilc.org. And so we'll begin first asking Diana a series of questions around DREAM. First, why is March 5th a false deadline?
Yeah, so definitely, like I mentioned before, I think it's a deadline that's up in the media because it is what Trump kind of gave as a deadline for Congress. He said you have 6 months to pass a legislative solution, but the reality is that the DACA program has ended. USCIS is no longer taking any applications as of September 5th. If your application had been in, they would process it, but any new ones sent in were not accepted. The only ones that were accepted were for those folks who expired between then and March 5th, and they had 1 month to get their application in, and if they didn't make it into that deadline, they were out of luck and they would not be able to renew their DACA. But in that 1 month period, no new applications were accepted. So if anybody aged into the program and now qualified because they were of age, they would not be able to apply. And so that's what we mean by March 5th as a false deadline. The program has already ended, and like I mentioned before, 122 people a day are losing their DACA status as a result of the program termination.
Thank you, Diana. So this is a tough question, but someone asks, what are the chances of the DREAM Act being passed by the end of this year?
Yeah, so that is definitely a difficult question because I wish I had a magic 8-ball, but all we know is that right now I think it's probably politically speaking, this is our highest chance that we've ever had because our allies on the Hill, being largely Democrats, do have some political leverage when it comes to that budget that I was talking about. This budget is something that Congress has to pass. And Republicans, even though they do have majority in both House and Senate, they do need Democratic votes to pass that year-end spending bill. And so they can say to the Republicans, give us a budget that addresses all of the issues that reflect our American values. Our American values means we need to protect dreamers, and that needs to be part of the deal, part of the budget, part of this year-end resolution. And so I can't speak to any percentages, but I know that this is our best chance to get it, and that's why this is the time to really act and raise your voice.
Thanks, Diana. And then for those who are less familiar with the provisions of the DREAM Act, would you mind briefly describing what the DREAM Act would do?
Yes, so the DREAM Act would, it became famous because I think of the termination of the DACA program, and so a lot of people associate it with providing a solution to those DACA recipients. But the DREAM Act, what it does is it actually provides a pathway to citizenship for young immigrants who, they came here at a young age, they've been here, grown up here, this is their home, they've gone to school, they work here, they contribute here. It gives them a pathway to citizenship. And what that looks like is they can either enroll in higher education to earn that citizenship, or they can join the military, or they can also just work and prove that they are working and contributing and paying taxes. They have to pass a background check and pass all of these different requirements. And if they pass all those requirements, then they would eventually qualify for citizenship. First, they go through conditional permanent residency status, then they would get through legal permanent residency status once they fulfill all those requirements. And then eventually, after being a legal permanent resident, they would eventually be able to qualify for citizenship.
Thank you, Diana. And then we've seen a lot of members of Congress show support for the DACA population, but how do you interpret that? Is there a possibility that when people talk about that, they talk about keeping a program like DACA with no path to citizenship, or do you think there's support for something broader, like something that would have a pathway to citizenship?
Yeah, and I think this is really closely tied to the last question as well, because I think it's important to first, make the distinction that DACA recipients are dreamers, but not all dreamers are DACA recipients. The DACA was a temporary solution for just a few folks because it had a lot more stricter requirements than the DREAM Act, and so that's only about 800,000 people, but the DREAM Act itself would actually enable over 2 million people to qualify. But they said that same description again of being here since they were young and calling America their home. And so right now, I think the support, it really is for a DREAM Act. This is the most support that we have ever seen. About 90% of American voters support Dreamers staying here and earning their citizenship, and it's a bipartisan support that includes 80% of Republicans, which have typically not been supportive of certain kinds of immigration issues, but they are very supportive of the specific group of people. And there are a few kind of extremists out there in Congress who are still insistent on simply codifying DACA, and that basically just means to make DACA a permanent legislative thing, basically. So DACA, again, it was something that was renewable every 2 years, and it's only for those 800,000 people. But there's a certain subset that really want to pass what's called the Bridge Act, which would just make that DACA a permanent part of our immigration law, but that has no pathway to citizenship. But I would say that those are few and far in between right now. Certainly, every Democrat that I know is supportive of a pathway, and a good bit of Republicans are also very supportive. Just recently, there was a letter of 36 Republicans asking Speaker Ryan to find a solution for Dreamers to pass a pathway before the end of the year. And so it is by and large supported that Dreamers get a pathway to citizenship and not just a temporary work permit.
Thank you, Diana. The next question is if we can provide the call number to contact Congress. And so we have that listed in the chat box on your screen. That number is 1-888-778-6856. And we encourage you to call your representative and tell them that you want to see the DREAM Act passed before they go home for the holidays. Now we're going to take a break from DACA and DREAM to ask Abide some questions regarding the Muslim ban. The first question is there a hotline for individuals affected by the Muslim ban to call for support?
Yes, so there's a couple of different options for folks. There are specific coalitions in different parts of the country in Dulles and Los Angeles and San Francisco. But what I would encourage folks to do is certainly you can reach out to me at NILC, but also for people who are at airports, there's airport@refugeerights.org is one option. And then also for questions generally, you can either contact me directly. We also have a website called banquestions@nilc.org that you can write to, particularly if you're hearing of anyone that you know who's having issues either in airports or overseas as well.
Great, thank you. And then where can people find more information on the refugee ban? Is there one resource that lists all of the different bans, including how it affects visa lottery holders?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we have a short cheat sheet that sort of provides an at-a-glance overview of the 4 different versions of the Muslim ban. And it also includes what we think are connected policies in terms of other things that the administration is trying to do to target nationals from Muslim-majority countries and Muslims in general here in the United States as well. There's also a lot of other work that other organizations are doing, specifically on the Muslim ban. We are part of a campaign, the No Muslim Ban Ever campaign, with groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations of the San Francisco Bay Area, as well as Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus. We have our co-counsel and plaintiffs and other folks litigating challenges to the Muslim bans, including the ACLU, International Refugee Assistance Project, Muslim Advocates, Church World Service, and many other organizations. So there's a lot of places to go, but for the quick kind of at-a-glance overview, I think our cheat sheet will hopefully be a good starting point for folks.
Thank you, Abide. So going back to the topic of DACA, so as was mentioned earlier, there is no process for people to apply for DACA anymore. USCIS is not accepting any initial nor renewal applications at this time. They're only processing the ones that they have in the queue. And so, Jess, I'm hoping you can answer this question. What occurs with DACA recipients who have disabilities who were not able to reapply by the October 5th deadline if they were eligible to? What are the implications of that? Is there any recourse that they can take to get their application under consideration?
Thanks, Ignacia. So far, it's been really difficult to get USCIS to move, even on people who were able to reapply and their applications were rejected for various reasons. But I am a true believer in advocacy working. So I think that, I mean, there's no clear-cut answer to that question, but I do think that the more you can raise your voice and really share your story and either to USCIS or even, you know, plugging in through the legislative efforts to really spell out for lawmakers who may not understand the implications this has on your life, especially if you are a person with a disability. It's compounded even further what you have to go through. So yeah, feel free. I mean, if you are a person with a disability who had DACA and was not able to reapply and you would like to connect with us directly, feel free to do that. You can either do that through the survey linked in the DACA slides, or you can reach out to me directly and we can kind of brainstorm. Again, there's not a clear-cut answer, but I'm happy to work with folks if you want to reach out directly.
Thank you, Jess. So we would like to thank you all for joining us today. We would like to thank all of our panelists for sharing with us their time and expertise. As I mentioned, we will be sharing a recording of this webinar. So if there's something you missed, something that you want to listen to on your own time, feel free to. Once you get the recording, you should be receiving that on Monday. You will also have a copy of all of the slides with hyperlinks included, so you will have access to that information as well. And then, of course, we encourage you to visit our website, milk.org, for more information. Thank you all.